So next up we have Dr. Martin Ferguson-Pell, who's a biomedical engineer and clinical scientist. He's dedicated his entire academic career to the study of secondary complications of physical disability and studying the underlying causes that reduce their incidence. He designed and developed a new rehabilitation robotics laboratory in the Edmonton Clinic Health Academy and uses virtual reality systems to simulate the biomechanical and physiological conditions faced by long-term wheelchair users and elite wheelchair athletes. His research team is developing advanced telemedicine technologies for management of patients living in remote settings where access to specialist rehabilitation care is very limited. Martin? Come on up.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to recognize that I'm also a professor at the Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine, U of A, and also Executive Director of the Alberta Bone and Joint Health Institute here in Calgary. So I want to talk about some things that are pretty blue sky. So I hope you'll forgive me for really talking about things that are not currently available, but I think they represent a wonderful opportunity going forward and are addressing, I think, a very critical problem that we face, not just in Alberta and Canada, but is a worldwide problem, and that is, how do we provide support for people who live in more remote settings? So in Alberta, for example, somewhere in the region of 17 or 18% of our population live in what we would classify as rural settings. One of the challenges that they face is how do they access the kind of specialist care that, for example, Judy can provide as a specialist physical therapist who's very knowledgeable, is a world-class physical therapist in the field of the shoulder. And so what we're wondering is, are there some ways that we can use advanced information technologies that would be able to provide at least some support for those patients? And the shoulder is a particularly interesting area to look at because, as Judy pointed out, somewhere in the region of 80% of people with shoulder problems can have that shoulder problem resolved through appropriate conservative management. So if we're able to provide care for people in place in that rural setting, then that would be able to, A, improve their access to care, and B, it would mean they wouldn't have to travel into an urban center to get support. So Dr. Cy Frank, who is one of the visionaries in orthopedics from Alberta and has been a strong supporter of many initiatives that in the way we represent when we come together in the Wood Forum, talks a lot about the concept of the living lab. The idea that you create a population that is able to provide information that we can use for research and innovation. And in this particular area, I think we have a wonderful opportunity, because if you look at this population density map, what you can see in the different colors is the relative population of people across Canada. So in Alberta, we have the two outstanding urban centers able to provide world-class clinical support and academic activities for innovation across the whole medical field in Calgary and in Edmonton. And surrounding them, we have our much more dispersed population. So if we were able to provide a sort of hub and spoke model, where the hub would be at those urban centers, but able to reach out more effectively to people in those more remote settings, we have the perfect living lab to be able to develop improvements in the care of people who live in remote communities that would not only be beneficial in Alberta and Canada, but would have an impact right across the world. So Alberta Health Services has a vision for 2020, and one of the elements within that vision is enhancing access to high-quality services in rural areas. So we're right in line in the things that we're talking about today that relate to priorities that Alberta Health Services has already identified. One of the things I'd like to emphasize in what I'm going to show you is that it's actually relatively low cost. If you look at the business model we might build around the outreach to rural communities, the savings that we could make in terms of travel costs alone for people to come into urban centers can almost certainly cover many times over the costs that we would have to invest in actually purchasing the technology to support them. The other thing is that these technologies are coming down in cost very rapidly because of our tendency to use these very advanced technologies in our everyday lives. And also thanks to our friends, the gamers. The gamers use these technologies and drive them hard. They're enthusiastic, and they drive down the cost. So thank you, millennials. What you're doing in gaming technology is going to have a huge impact in the boomers who are going to need care out in the more rural settings. And you'll see what I mean in a second. So this is Judy at work doing an assessment in a typical face-to-face kind of environment, where she will ask the patient to perform a series of tasks, and using her experience and observations, she'll use that information in order to build a picture of what is happening with this particular patient. So she's looking at structures in the back and in the shoulders, just as she was describing before. And so this is the sort of typical face-to-face type of assessment that would be done in trying to determine what are the underlying causes of a patient's shoulder problem, or the same things are done, for example, for knees and hips and backs and so on. Problem is, if Judy is in Edmonton and our patient is in a remote part of Alberta, can we simply rely on the plain video image to enable us to do that kind of assessment? And I would argue almost certainly not. We need to enhance the information that we get from that rural setting. Secondly, we're going to be relying on a second person in this picture. So it would be Judy, for example, in the urban setting, and a generalist clinician who might be in that remote setting. Someone who's going to be a supporter and a helper in the assessment, but not necessarily an expert. So there are various tools, and I'm in a way going to show you like a bunch of tools. It's like a toolbox that we could put out there in a remote setting. And then we ask the question, how can those tools be used to create that rural assessment of the patient's needs versus the face-to-face type of assessment that you just saw that Judy was doing? So one of the tools that we could use is motion capture. And what we do with motion capture is we place little reflective markers on various parts of the body that we want to assess. And then we use a special camera system that will then determine the position of those markers in space and then send that information through the internet down to the urban center. So what we can do is we can track landmarks and look at how those landmarks move by simply placing markers on them and using a special camera. The cool thing about that is that the amount of data that has to be transmitted is really very little, in that all we're doing is sending the coordinates of those markers across the internet. It uses very little bandwidth to be able to do that. Secondly, this motion capture system, which when I started out was a real headache. It would take you about a day just to calibrate it, let alone dealing with all of the data that it generated, is now much easier to use. So for example, you can get a sort of a sweatshirt kind of device with markers on it, and you have the person put it on, it's a little bit stretchy, and then they've got the markers in place without too much of a hassle. Secondly, the cameras are now much simpler. They're pre-calibrated. You put them on a tripod, you plonk them on the floor, you're done. Now you can start to gather data. And this picture, the one on the, what is your bottom left, is me sending marker data across the internet from one location to another. So that gives you an idea of the sort of things that we can collect in terms of marker information. So this is great. Maybe it's overkill, though. Because in Medicine Hat, there's a company that's recently produced a really interesting technology that is very suitable for clinical assessment, that is a markerless system. So what it does is it takes the image of the person, and it then estimates roughly where it thinks the joint centers are, where the elbows are, where the shoulders are, maybe where the hips are, and so on. And it says, well, I think it's roughly where they are. And then you can use that information in order to make measurements. So if you're interested in joint angles and things like that, this markerless system enables you to do those kinds of things. And again, you can send that information over the internet with very little bandwidth burden. Something I developed in my basement last weekend was a force glove. And so essentially what this force glove does, and it's very ugly, it needs to be made to look much nicer before we use it clinically, enables you to put little force sensors on the fingertips and then another one on the palm. On the left-hand side, you can see the device that enables us to interpret the data when we've sent it. So the person in the remote setting has the force glove, they place it on various parts of the patient and press, and we get information about how much force is being applied. The person in the urban center on the right-hand side has their fingertips on little vibration devices. So what happens is the harder the remote therapist pushes, the stronger the vibration is felt by the person who is in the urban center. So it gives them the sense of feedback. It's called haptic feedback. Very low cost. Now I want to show you this.
Hi, today
It'll
we're going to
blow
show you an
away.
exciting new technology that could fundamentally change the way that people will communicate in the future. To make all this happen, we've had to create a new type of 3D capture technology. I'm surrounded by these 3D cameras that we've developed in our team. Each of them is capturing me from a separate viewpoint, and we're fusing this data together to create a temporally consistent model, as you can see reconstructed live behind me. Now, the camera that's filming me has a HoloLens tracking system attached, and this allows us to take these 3D models and composite them in real time into the real world, as you can see here. And that gives you a sense of the fidelity of the reconstructions that we can achieve. Once we have these reconstructions, we can texture them. We can then compress the data and transmit the data over to the other side. Over on the other side, a user wearing a HoloLens can see these remote participants live in their space as if they're co-present. And that's what we're showing you picture in picture. Now imagine using this type of capture technology to connect with family members who are thousands of miles away. And that's exactly what we're going to demonstrate to you right now. My daughter is stood in a similar capture rig somewhere else in our lab. And she's going to holoport into my space, and I'm going to interact with her wearing my HoloLens.
Hi, Bob, I miss you.
Hey, Lilia, I miss you too.
When you coming home?
I'm coming home very soon. Let me get out of your way. Now, in that example, we were demonstrating live 3D capture. But our system is capable of another thing. We can actually record and play back that entire session. Now, this is almost like reversing through time. And if I wear my HoloLens device, it's almost like walking into a living memory that I can see through another pair of eyes from all these different perspectives. And because this is 3D content, we can miniaturize it onto this coffee table and experience it in a more convenient manner. And this becomes a magical way of experiencing these live captured memories. Now imagine being able to teleport to any place with anyone at any time. And that's what holoportation is all about. Thank you for watching.
So that is work that Microsoft is doing. They've been working on this for a little while. They put that out about a year ago. And my guess is it's going to take sort of 4 or 5 more years before that becomes mainstream. So what I'm interested in doing for Alberta is us putting in place the capability to then be ready to respond when Microsoft says, I wonder if we could use this in medicine. What if we could use this to help to support people in rural settings? So what we're doing in my lab essentially is trying to establish, if you like, a platform that we could use to capture this kind of technology and put it to work in this particular application area. So this is the concept of what it might look like. If you like, what we're doing is collecting multiple channels of data. We're collecting that force glove data, that motion capture data, if you like. We can do EMG, we can do eye gaze, we can do balance measurements, you name it. There are sensors out there. It's called the Internet of Things. And so we can have an Internet of Things, a box of goodies, if you like, that we put into rural settings that we could use then to do various types of clinical assessment. It could include that holoportation technique that you just saw from Microsoft as yet another channel of information. But just seeing the person in 3D isn't enough to do the clinical assessment. It just adds value, adds complexity to the information that we need to do a good assessment. But the idea is that if you imagine these multiple channels of information being generated in the rural setting, they get sent down the pipe through the internet to the urban center, where the clinician is sitting there wearing a HoloLens type device. And so the challenge you have is with all of these channels of information that you might need to use, how do you see the one that you're most interested in at any moment in time? How do you see it close enough in enough detail to be able to do a really good job? So the idea then would be that you could port. Essentially what that means is that you gaze and move close in the virtual world to an image that you're particularly interested in. So this would be an EMG signal, for example, muscle activity. This one is EKG. I'm just using some examples. This one down here is an example of the markerless motion capture system that I described. And this one over here is the marker-based motion capture system. You name it. It's whatever the clinician wants to use. Could be a channel. So what you can do is look at it through your HoloLens device and then port to the information that you're particularly wanting to focus on. So if you could imagine what this all looks like then in the remote clinic, you've got a whole bunch of signals being generated. They then get captured by a server, sent down the internet, and then spread back out again into a HoloLens device to enable you as a clinician to observe them and interact and undertake the clinical assessment. Why are we not moving? Here we go. So this is what it might look like. This is someone wearing the HoloLens device, and it could be any other kind of device that enables you to do augmented reality. So what you see simultaneously is the real-world screen in front of you, plus these virtual channels of data superimposed on top. So this is where we are so far. So we've only been doing this for about 3 or 4 months. So this is very crude, and it's using very low-cost equipment. So what you can see is the little boy of my researcher. This is rather like what that guy from Microsoft was doing, but just with one $250 camera. So we're not there yet in terms of resolution, really capturing the 3D, but it shows the potential of what we can do. Those little beams going out are the person interacting with these different channels and selecting them and moving them around in virtual space so that the ones that they're particularly interested in, they can therefore concentrate on. So you see the pixelation problems we've got right now, but that's simply a matter of more technology and more cameras. So that's the picture so far. That's where we're going. And I think you can see this has applications in shoulders, but in other areas of orthopedics as well. And I just wanted to share with you what I think is a really exciting future going forward in terms of how we can support people in rural settings. The final thing I wanted to say, which I think is a really interesting and unexpected opportunity associated with this technology, is that because we're having to transmit data from that remote setting into the urban setting, we're collecting data we don't normally collect when we do a traditional physical therapy assessment. So we can now put all of that data into the repository, and we can start to mine it, or we can play it back, just like he showed in that Microsoft video. And that enables us to transfer information from one therapist to another therapist very efficiently and accurately. So I think that's an unexpected benefit of being able to develop this technology that may also be of benefit to people living in urban settings as well. So thanks very much.